under the blazing sun of a frontier town, where dust clung to every boot and whispers traveled faster than bullets. The air grew heavy with cruel laughter. On that day, the crowd gathered not to celebrate, but to mock. At the center of the wooden stage stood a young bride, her veil thin and her eyes unseeing. The auctioneer's voice cut through the silence like a whip, and every sneer from the townsfolk carried the sting of humiliation. They laughed not because they found joy, but because they thought blindness made her powerless, unworthy of dignity or love. The sound of ridicule spread like wildfire, echoing through the dry air, feeding the arrogance of those who believed themselves superior. The bride's hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of her dress, her heart pounding with the weight of shame. Each laugh pierced her chest like a dagger, reminding her that she stood alone, stripped of protection, left at the mercy of men who saw her as nothing more than an object for trade. The cruelty of the moment painted a picture darker than any storm on the horizon. But silence has a power greater than mockery, and from the shadows of the crowd, a figure shifted. He wore no medal, no badge, no sign of wealth or status. His hat covered his eyes, and his boots carried the dust of 1,000 miles. For a moment, no one noticed him, a cowboy who had learned that actions speak louder than words, that a man's worth is measured not by the noise he makes, but by the stand he takes. And when he rose, the laughter faltered. The hush that fell over the crowd was sharper than the wind that howled across the desert. Every eye turned toward the silent rider, whose presence alone broke the rhythm of mockery. He said nothing, but the way he stood, tall, unshaken, and unafraid, was enough to bend the atmosphere. In that instant, the blind bride was no longer just a victim of cruelty. She became the center of a story that would shake the pride of every man and woman who had dared to laugh. This was not just an auction, not just another cruel chapter in a harsh land. This was the beginning of a tale where silence spoke louder than ridicule, where dignity rose higher than derision, and where one cowboy's quiet defiance would change the destiny of a forgotten bride. And as the dust settled around his boots, the town began to realize that the day would not end the way they had imagined. The sun blazed overhead like judgment from heaven, and the dust on the auction ground thickened with every boot that stomped against the wooden planks. The blind bride stood still, the silence of her own world more merciful than the crowd's laughter. She couldn't see their sneers, but she could hear the venom in their voices, the way they laughed not just at her condition, but at her very existence. To them, she was damaged goods, a burden to be sold off like a broken saddle. But behind the veil of her eyes, a fire still flickered, the kind of quiet strength only hardship could forge. In the Old West, women like her were tossed aside by misfortune, judged not by who they were, but by what they had lost. She had lost her sight, yes, but not her soul, not her dignity. Her name was Clara, and though the world had turned its back on her, she never stopped believing in her worth. Her father had been a preacher before the fever took him, and he had raised her with stories of courage, of women who stood tall even when the ground beneath them collapsed. Clara clung to those stories now, whispering their truth under her breath as the bidding began. One man offered a handful of coins, laughing as he said he'd teach her to scrub floors in the dark. Another promised to trade her for 2 barrels of whiskey by sundown. The auctioneer smiled, feeding the crowd's frenzy, knowing that spectacle sold better than silence. Clara clenched her jaw and held her head high. She could not see the faces around her, but she could feel their heat, their hunger to humiliate. And yet, she didn't cry. She didn't plead. She remembered her father's voice. "They can take your eyes, child, but never let them take your spirit." Suddenly, the air shifted. A soundless tension rippled through the crowd. Boots scraped against wood as a figure stepped forward, not with noise, but with presence. The laughter died in throats as eyes turned to the lone cowboy. He wore dust like armor and silence like a blade. His coat, long and sun-bleached, billowed faintly in the wind. No one knew his name. He had ridden into town just days before, slept in the barn behind the saloon, spoke to no one. But now, in front of the blind bride, he stood like the ghost of justice risen from the plains. Without a word, he placed a silver coin on the stage, more than the others had bid combined. The crowd froze. The auctioneer stared, confused. But the cowboy didn't speak. He simply looked at Clara, or rather, through her, as if he saw the truth of who she was. Then, he turned to face the crowd, his silence heavier than any threat. It was the kind of silence that told stories, of men buried without honor, of women wronged and never avenged, of a land that devoured the weak unless someone chose to stand. Clara's heart thundered in her chest, uncertain whether this was deliverance or another cruel joke. She turned her head, straining to hear his voice, but none came. The cowboy remained still, his presence a question no one dared answer. The auctioneer hesitated, then muttered a declaration of sale, more out of fear than formality. And just like that, the crowd that had feasted on mockery now swallowed their shame. The cowboy walked toward Clara, took her hand gently, and guided her down the stage. The crowd parted for them like cattle before a storm. As they stepped away, whispers began to crawl among the onlookers. Who was he? Why would a man like that, strong, silent, feared, bid on a blind woman? But they didn't understand what he saw. This cowboy, who had watched friends die in the dust, who had seen innocence traded for bullets and mercy bled dry, recognized something rare in Clara. Not pity, never pity, but resilience. The same kind he had buried too many times under the western sun. He didn't buy her. He saved her from a world that had no more use for kindness. They didn't speak that day, not with words. He brought her to a quiet cabin near the edge of town, left water at her table, and returned to the porch. Clara sat in silence, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, mind racing. She didn't know this man, yet something about his stillness made her feel safer than she had in years. There was no pressure, no questions, no expectations, just presence. And in a world so loud with cruelty, silence had become a form of grace. The townsfolk watched with curiosity, their cruelty turning into curiosity, and then something closer to regret. The saloon owner swore he'd seen that cowboy once take down 3 outlaws without drawing his gun, just walked into their camp and stared till they ran. The blacksmith whispered that maybe he wasn't just a man, but a spirit sent to punish those who forgot their humanity. Whatever the stories, one truth remained. No one laughed at Clara anymore. They couldn't. The cowboy had changed something more than her fate. He had exposed their shame. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Clara stepped onto the porch. She stood beside the cowboy, listening to the wind, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" she asked. And though he didn't reply, she felt it, in the quiet between their breaths, in the steadiness of his presence. He had seen the world for what it was, brutal, unkind, unforgiving. But in her, he saw something still worth protecting, something the West had nearly forgotten. And for once, silence was the answer she needed. Days passed like drifting tumbleweeds, quiet and unhurried. Clara learned to navigate the cabin by memory, counting steps, listening to the creak of each floorboard, memorizing the way sunlight warmed certain walls in the morning. The cowboy, whose name she still didn't know, repaired fences and chopped wood. He rarely spoke, but every gesture spoke volumes. When she reached for the kettle, it was already warm. When she stepped outside, the path was swept. He treated her not like someone broken, but like someone whole. And in that, she began to remember who she truly was. In the harsh language of the West, people only understood power and fear. But in the quiet moments Clara now shared with him, she discovered a different strength, one built on patience, not force. The cowboy never touched her unless she reached for him first. He never pitied her, never stared at her eyes like the others did. Instead, he listened. And in a world where most men filled the silence with noise, this one honored it like sacred ground. It was a kind of reverence she hadn't known since her father's prayers. The town grew uneasy. Their laughter had turned into questions, and questions into guilt. Children, once taught to mock the weak, now watched the cowboy with wide eyes. Women passed by Clara with softened steps, some leaving baskets of bread by her gate, others only daring to meet her face for a second before lowering their eyes. The blacksmith, who had roared with laughter at the auction, hammered quieter now. The schoolteacher stopped reciting the tale of the blind bride in jest, and instead told it as a lesson in dignity. Clara felt the shift, not just in the town, but in herself. For so long, she had lived as if darkness meant limitation. But now, in her blindness, she could see deeper than most. She heard hesitation in voices that once carried cruelty. She felt hesitation where once there had been scorn. And she knew, without sight, that something in this place was being rewritten. Not because she had begged, but because one man stood beside her and refused to let the world treat her as less than sacred. One afternoon, as thunder echoed beyond the hills, Clara asked the cowboy again, "Why did you choose me?" This time he answered. His voice was low, slow, like gravel under hooves. "Because I saw you stand taller than any man on that stage." She smiled. It wasn't just what he said. It was that he saw her. Not the veil, not the silence, not the blindness. Her. And in that moment, the West felt a little less cruel, as if the land itself paused to listen. But peace is a fragile thing in places where law is just a suggestion, and mercy is often mistaken for weakness. News of the auction and the cowboy's silent defiance traveled beyond town lines. One evening, a group of riders thundered in, the kind who didn't come talk. Outlaws with smoke in their eyes and pistols itching for a reason. They mocked the town for going soft, for letting a blind woman and her ghost guardian stir shame in hearts that once knew only pride. Their leader, a scarred brute named Calder, spat on the sheriff's boots and demanded the cowboy face him. The town held its breath. Clara, though blind, could feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. The cowboy didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stepped forward and looked Calder in the eye. The outlaw laughed. "You gonna stare me to death, ghost?" he barked. But the cowboy's silence cut deeper than any insult. And before Calder could draw, the cowboy moved, swift, clean, no wasted motion. One shot. Calder dropped like a stone. The others froze. No one else dared to move. The message was clear. Silence didn't mean weakness. It meant precision. The town remembered that day for years. Not because blood was shed, but because the man they feared and misunderstood had drawn a line no one dared cross. Clara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing, heart pounding. She hadn't heard fear in the cowboy's step, only resolve. And she knew, then, that the man who saved her wasn't just passing through. He had anchored himself in that town's conscience. After that day, something in the town truly changed. Men nodded to Clara with respect. Children offered her flowers. And though she never asked for it, the townsfolk began to follow her quiet example. They spoke less and listened more. The sheriff started patrolling again. The preacher, once drunk by midday, now opened the chapel doors before sunrise. The town had been shaken awake, not by a storm, but by a stillness they couldn't explain. The cowboy didn't preach. He lived, and that was enough. That night, Clara sat beside him by the fire. "Do you think they've really changed?" she asked. He stared into the flames. "They will," he said, "as long as someone reminds them how." She reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. The world had been cruel to both of them in different ways, but somehow, in the vast loneliness of the West, they had found in each other a reason to hope and to stay. Spring crept over the land like a whispered promise, softening the sharp edges of winter and painting the horizon with golden fields. Clara walked more now, cane in hand, moving confidently down the dusty paths of the town. Children ran to greet her, guiding her hands to feel the flowers blooming along the fences. Shopkeepers called her by name, offering goods not out of pity, but out of newfound respect. The town that once mocked her now watched her, not with laughter, but with reverence. She had become, without asking, a symbol of silent strength. The cowboy still said little. He fixed roofs, helped mend wagon wheels, and watched the sun rise each day from the same hill beyond the chapel. Yet, everyone knew his presence was the root of the change. He had planted something in the town, a seed of dignity, of reckoning. He was a ghost not because he haunted, but because he revealed truths people didn't want to see. And like a ghost, he reminded them that past sins cannot be erased, only acknowledged and redeemed. Even the saloon, once loud with cruelty, now carried a quiet respect whenever Clara walked by. One afternoon, Clara stood by the well when a young girl approached, shy and fidgeting. "Miss Clara," she whispered, My papa used to laugh at you. But he cries now, when he sees you smile. Clara bent to hold the girl's hand, her heart swelling with something deeper than forgiveness. Tell him he's not alone, she said. Sometimes we don't see clearly until we close our eyes. The girl didn't fully understand the words, but she nodded. And in that simple exchange, another crack formed in the wall the town had built between cruelty and compassion. But not everyone welcomed change. In the far edge of the territory, old enemies stirred, men who thrived on fear and control. One of them, a former outlaw named Brigson, had once ruled the surrounding lands with fire and chain. He heard whispers of the blind bride and the silent cowboy who had humbled a whole town without raising his voice. Men like that, he growled to his gang, are dangerous. They teach others they don't need to be afraid anymore. And so, with vengeance riding shotgun, Brigson mounted his horse and rode toward the town that had found its conscience. The wind carried dust and foreboding as word spread of Brigson's approach. The townsfolk gathered near the chapel, fear twisting their hearts. Clara stood among them, calm. We don't run, she said, her voice steady. Not anymore. The sheriff looked at her, his hands shaking, then turned to the cowboy. Will you stand with us? He asked. The cowboy tipped his hat, eyes fixed on the horizon. Always. It was the first time many had heard him speak, and in that single word, the town found its courage again. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the town, a heavy stillness filled the air, the kind that comes before a reckoning. Brigson's gang arrived like a thunderclap, hooves pounding and guns glinting in the dying light. But this time, the townsfolk didn't scatter. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, women holding lanterns, men gripping tools turned weapons, and children clinging to the hands of those they once saw as ordinary. The cowboy stepped to the front, alone, facing the dust cloud that brought violence with it. Brigson dismounted slowly, eyeing the crowd with contempt. His voice boomed. Who here thinks they can stop me? No one answered. Instead, Clara stepped forward, her hair braided back, her hands firm. We don't need to stop you, she said. You'll stop yourself when you realize no one fears you anymore. Laughter erupted from Brigson's men, but it rang hollow, forced. The truth of her words pressed against them like the dry heat of the land itself. The cowboy said nothing. He didn't have to. His hand rested lightly near his holster, calm as a still lake. Brigson drew, fast and mean, but the cowboy was faster. The shot echoed like judgment, and Brigson dropped, wounded but alive. His men froze, looking not at the cowboy, but at the town. No one begged, no one ran. This place had changed, and so had its people. With a nod from the cowboy, the sheriff stepped forward and bound Brigson's hands. Justice, long forgotten in those parts, had returned, not with fury, but with resolve. The outlaws rode away, their power broken not by bullets, but by unity. That night, fires glowed along the streets, not from destruction, but celebration. Music played, awkward at first, then full of warmth. Clara sat on the porch beside the cowboy, the stars stretching wide above them. I never thought they'd stand, she whispered. They just needed a reason, he replied. Someone to remind them what standing looks like. She turned her head toward him. And what about you? What made you stand that day at the auction? He paused, the silence long and deliberate. Because I know what it's like to be looked at and not seen. The words hung in the air, soft and heavy. In the West, where people carved their stories in sweat and blood, this story had been carved in silence, in presence, in quiet defiance. And while others used guns and gold to leave their mark, the cowboy had used nothing but stillness, and a blind bride who refused to bow. Together, they hadn't just changed a town. They had reminded it what it meant to be human. As summer rolled in and the earth cracked under the weight of the sun, the town breathed a different air. The wind that once carried gossip and scorn now whispered respect. Strangers began to arrive, not for the saloon or the promise of gold, but to see the place where silence had become power, and where a blind woman taught an entire town how to see again. The legend of Clara and the cowboy spread like wildfire, not because it was loud, but because it carried truth. And truth, in the West, was the rarest kind of currency. Clara found herself surrounded by people asking questions, not out of curiosity, but out of longing. How did you survive? How did you stay strong? She never claimed to be special. She spoke softly, always with care. Because no one can take from you what you refuse to surrender, she would say. And when people asked about the cowboy, she'd smile. He doesn't save with his hands. He saves with the way he stands. That was enough to silence the room, because everyone knew what kind of man could change the course of lives without saying a word. The town slowly became a place where others came to find themselves. Wounded folks, widows with calloused hands, war veterans carrying ghosts in their eyes. They came not for healing, but for belonging. And in Clara, they found both. She opened her home, taught others how to navigate in darkness, and reminded them that sight was never the measure of strength. The cowboy built an extra room for travelers. He never asked questions. He simply handed them a shovel, a hammer, or a bowl of stew, whatever their spirit needed most. But even paradise has shadows. One morning, Clara awoke to find the cowboy gone. No note, no warning, just his hat hanging on the wall, and his coat missing from the hook. Her breath caught in her throat, a familiar ache blooming in her chest, the ache of abandonment, of not knowing if goodbye meant forever. The townsfolk searched the trails, questioned riders, and scoured the hills. But there was no sign, only dust and silence. And for days, Clara sat on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, listening for the sound of boots that never came. People wept with her. The sheriff offered to ride out every day. The blacksmith left food at her gate. But she didn't cry, not in front of them. Instead, she listened to the wind, to the birds, to the whisper of his presence still lingering in the air. And though the world had gone quiet, she knew he hadn't left her. Not truly. The cowboy was never a man of roots. He was a wind that passed through broken things and made them whole again. And now, perhaps, somewhere else, someone else needed him more. Time stretched like a long trail over open plains. Months passed. Clara kept walking the same paths, pouring water for the garden, humming by the fire, touching the brim of his hat every morning. And though the ache of his absence never faded, it grew familiar, like a scar that reminds you of both pain and survival. She didn't speak his name. She didn't need to. Every soul in town remembered him. Every child who learned to stand up for someone weaker carried a piece of his shadow. Then one evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a boy galloped into town with wild eyes and a story that sent shivers down every spine. A town down south, it was burning. Bandits, dozens of them. Said a man stopped them. Alone. Didn't speak. Just stood there while they fled like scared dogs. Clara's heart skipped. She didn't need to ask his name. She only whispered, "He found them." The boy nodded, still catching his breath. They called him the Quiet Flame. The name spread quickly, not just in that town, but across territories. He became myth and memory, legend and ghost. Some said he had been a preacher's son. Others claimed he once faced a firing squad and walked away untouched. But Clara knew the truth was simpler. He was just a man who knew the cost of silence and the weight of compassion. And wherever cruelty raised its voice too loud, he became the quiet that reminded the world of its conscience. And then one day, just as the leaves began to fall again, Clara heard boots on the porch. Not many, just one pair, slow, deliberate, familiar. Her breath caught. She didn't stand. She didn't speak. She just waited, listening as the footsteps paused by the door. Then, a familiar coat was laid gently across her shoulders from behind. She reached up, fingers brushing the fabric she knew like her own skin. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. He was back. He didn't need to explain where he'd gone. She didn't ask. He sat beside her, just like always, and together they watched the wind move through the trees. No fanfare, no speeches, just presence, just peace. In a world so full of noise, their story had always been written in silence, a silence that said more than words ever could. The days that followed carried a stillness more powerful than thunder. The town, now seasoned by growth and grace, welcomed the cowboy's return with no celebration, no parade, just quiet nods and long-held glances that said, "We remember." He walked the streets as he always had, boots stirring the dust, eyes calm and unreadable. But something in him had shifted. He was leaner, perhaps, marked by the wind of other storms. And yet, when he looked at Clara, the years seemed to fold, and the space between them vanished like morning mist. Clara never asked what battles he had fought, but she felt them in his silences. Some nights, he would stare at the fire a little longer, and she would place her hand gently on his. In those moments, no words were needed. In the Old West, pain didn't always scream. Sometimes it just stood beside you and breathed. And so they sat together, two scars shaped like people, understanding that survival was not about being untouched, but about choosing to keep walking again and again. With his return, more travelers came. Word had spread of the blind woman and the silent man, two souls who turned a town's cruelty into courage. A widow from Red River arrived with her daughters, seeking shelter from a violent past. A boy with a twisted leg came hoping to learn how to ride. Each found more than safety. They found meaning. The cabin grew into a haven. Not a church, not a mission, just a place where no one had to explain their pain to be understood. Clara began teaching the children how to read by touch, creating letters from leather and thread. The cowboy built benches and taught the boys how to ride, how to fall, and, most importantly, how to stand back up. But he never told them stories. He made them. Through every act of quiet protection, through every fence he mended and every hand he reached for, he proved that some heroes wear no badge, carry no titles, and leave behind no name, only footprints carved into the soul. One afternoon, as Clara sat under the old tree near the well, a stranger approached her, a young man with wild eyes and shaking hands. "I came to challenge him," he said breathlessly. "The story said he's the strongest man in the West." Clara tilted her head. "He is," she replied gently, "but not because of how he fights, because of how he chooses not to." The young man fell quiet, ashamed. She offered him a seat beside her. "If you truly want to be strong," she said, "learn to protect something, not conquer it." That final autumn brought a golden hue to everything the light touched. Trees dressed themselves in amber, and the wind spoke in low murmurs, as if even the earth itself didn't want to disturb the peace that had settled over the town. The cowboy and Clara, now older in years but sharper in spirit, walked together each morning along the ridge beyond the chapel. He described the sunrise to her in few words, always the same ones, still beautiful, still worth it. And that was all she needed to hear. On one particular morning, a letter arrived, worn, dusty, and bearing the seal of a distant town. It spoke of a sheriff who had been murdered, of children stolen, and of a town paralyzed by fear. The letter ended with 4 words: "We need the quiet one." The townspeople gathered, watching as the cowboy read the letter slowly, then folded it without a word. Clara, sitting on the porch with her shawl drawn close, nodded before he even looked at her. "You have to go," she said. "They need you more than I do." His eyes met hers, not with sorrow, but with understanding. "You'll be all right?" he asked. She smiled softly. "I always have been." He stood, strapped his worn holster to his waist, and placed his hat gently on her head. It was the only time she cried, not out of grief but gratitude, for having known him, for being chosen, for being seen. The town walked with him to the edge of the hills, and though no one said goodbye, every heart whispered it in silence. Clara never knew where he went after that. No one did. Some claimed to have seen him riding toward the mountains. Others swore he saved a railroad camp from a fire, or stood between a banker's daughter and a bullet. But Clara didn't need to hear those stories. She already carried the most important one inside her. She lived it. And when children sat at her feet asking about the blind bride and the silent cowboy, she would nod and say, "He didn't save me. He reminded me I was never broken." In time, they built a bench beneath the old tree near the well, one that faced the horizon he always watched. No plaque, no carving, just a place where the wind could rest and the silence could speak. And every evening, Clara sat there with a lantern by her side, waiting, not for his return, but for the next soul wandering lost, who needed a story to believe in, the story of the day the world laughed at a blind bride, until the silent cowboy stood up. The story of Clara and the silent cowboy was never meant to be just a tale of the Old West. It is, at its heart, A reminder that strength doesn't always arrive with thunder, and justice doesn't always ride in with noise. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of someone who sees worth where others see weakness, who listens when the world shouts, and who stands up not to be seen, but because it's right. That single moment at the auction, when everyone laughed, became the turning point for an entire town. Because one man chose to stand. Clara's journey from ridicule to reverence teaches us that no voice is ever truly silenced. Not by blindness, not by shame, not by the cruelty of others. Her resilience wasn't born from vengeance, but from dignity. And it was her unwavering spirit that transformed the way others saw her, and eventually, how they saw themselves. True change doesn't come from speeches or sermons. It comes from presence, from standing beside someone when no one else will. In a world so quick to discard what it doesn't understand, Clara became a mirror of grace. And the cowboy, he didn't need to speak to leave a legacy. His actions were his language. He taught us that courage isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, and unwavering. He showed us that the ones who change the world are not always the ones who seek the spotlight, but the ones who step forward when the world turns away. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was full of meaning, full of purpose. He became legend not because of what he said, but because of what he did when it mattered most. So if this story has stirred something in you, a sense of justice, a longing for quiet strength, or the courage to stand up for someone forgotten, hold on to it. Let it change the way you see people, the way you react to silence, and the way you measure greatness. Because sometimes, the most powerful heroes are the ones who never speak a word. And sometimes, the greatest love stories are written in the space between footsteps, in the choice to stay or to return. If this story moved you, take a moment to be part of something greater. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next tale that speaks to the soul. Like the video to help others find this message, and leave a comment sharing what part of the story struck you most. Your voice can carry this legacy forward, just like the cowboy's silence once did.